Okay, so welcome back. We are continuing our conversation about prejudice and has it, decreased over time. So the first day we talked about old-fashioned prejudice. Today we're talking about modern symbolic prejudice. And what this is a form, of prejudice where individuals think of themselves as valuing equality and respect for all people, while they simultaneously oppose social change that would allow equality to occur. So they may say, I believe all people should have equal rights. But then if someone says, well, in order to have equal rights, my group needs this, they would oppose that and say, that's not necessary. You don't need that. Okay. So the example I gave here is a sign from a homeless man that says, everyone wants to help the homeless, but no one wants them next door. Okay. This is this idea that we value equality and respect, but I don't want something to change for me in order to make that happen. So, what does this look like? Okay. So, people with this form of prejudice like to think of themselves as valuing equality and respect for all, but they also oppose social change that could help equality. And this type of ambivalence results in a resentment of minority groups and other historically oppressed groups when they ask for attention and resources. So, we can look first at the current protests right now that are happening all across this country in response to the murder of George Floyd by a police officer. And the protesters are asking for a stop to what they have asserted is a system of racism that results in police officers killing Black citizens. These protests have some Americans suggesting that there's no issue at all, and that people need to stop complaining. These are the same Americans who say all people are equal, right? Everyone should have the same thing, and they truly believe that's what our country is like. But they do not like when people protest and say, in order for us to be equal to you, we need this. Okay. We can also see, if you compare the Black Lives Matter movement, the Blue Lives Matter movement, and the All Lives Matter movement, they came in opposition to Black Lives Matter. So they didn't just originate, and they haven't just always been this thing that people proudly say and go demonstrate for. They said this in response to Black Lives Matter, even though the Black Lives Matter motto does not necessarily mean that blue lives don't matter and all lives don't matter. And again, you have to make a really clear distinction here, okay? So a blue life is not a thing because someone chooses to be a police officer. Someone doesn't choose to be Black or white or Asian, okay? So that kind of moves that one out of the category. Think of the All Lives Matter. This is the one that people really, we see a lot of conflict happening. I just saw a friend of mine have a conflict with a family member about just this phrase. The friend put up Black Lives Matter, the relative put up All Lives Matter, and they got into a really big quarrel, and now they don't even want to talk to each other anymore. Okay? If you think about this, people who would support and say all lives matter, in their mind, they believe that that is true. What they're not believing is that Black lives are being treated differently than others right now. Okay? So that is where the disconnect is. It's not that the All Lives Matter group doesn't think Black Lives Matter. It's not that the Black Lives Matter group doesn't think that the All Lives Matter. Their difference of opinion is on whether Black lives are being treated differently than the rest of the country. Okay, so that's really where this idea of modern symbolic prejudice comes in, where a lot of people who would say all lives matter truly believe that there is no such thing as discrimination. There is no such thing as racism and prejudice in our country right now. Depending on who you are, you will have a different experience, which will make you answer that differently. And that's very acceptable. The challenge is to get outside of your perspective and ask others who have lived a different life what their perspective is, okay? Because it's really easy to not see. I sometimes take for granted my position as a Black male in the Pacific Northwest, where some of the stories that I've heard from people who live in the South, it's nothing, I've experienced nothing like that. I've never personally have not experienced the type of interactions with police that other Black men around the country have. Does that mean that their experiences aren't real? No. However, it is easy for me in my day to day to not see that. And so I think that's one of the problems we find. There really doesn't need to be this division of Black lives, all lives, right? That's not significant. What has to happen is there needs to be an understanding of what issues truly are present in our country right now. So here's some of the beliefs of this type of prejudice, of modern symbolic prejudice. Someone who believes this would say that most forms of prejudice and discrimination no longer exist or are rare. They would say that any remaining group differences, so if Black people and white Americans have differences in socioeconomic outcomes or class, that those are the result of the Black people's lack of motivation to work hard. So they would suggest that if there's a wage gap between women and men, it's only because women don't work as hard. Okay? They would also believe that because those groups are unwilling to work toward goals, their continuing anger or claims of discrimination are not justified. They would say that rather than committing to more effort, those groups seek special favors like affirmative action or certain special things. They would also say relative to the historical majority or group that used to be in power, so we think of white landowning men in the United States, relative to that group, minorities have been getting more than they deserve due to these special favors. So you may have heard some of these things from family. You may have said one of these things yourself. You may have seen these on the news, social media. Okay, these are all beliefs that really fall under this modern symbolic prejudice category in social psych research. Okay, and then there's this idea that it's all in the past. Okay, so there's this thought that this type of prejudice blames groups without power for being powerless. So they say if there's not enough Black doctors, it's because Black people don't work to be doctors, or if there's not enough Hispanic teachers, it's because Hispanic people don't work to be teachers. They genuinely believe that minorities who are in oppressive situations are there because of their own lack of effort. That there's no system against them. There's nothing working against them. Now, history really would push back against that. A good understanding of history would push back against that. But again, that's for another conversation. People who are really high in the modern symbolic beliefs, they perceive that prejudice is no longer a problem. And they resent anything that appears to favor minorities, such as affirmative action policies and scholarships for people of color. They would say that it's no longer necessary and they think it represents reverse discrimination. Again, there's no such thing as reverse discrimination. There's only direct discrimination because discrimination does not belong to any group of people. Anyone can discriminate against someone else. We saw a Supreme Court case, Fisher versus the University of Texas, where Abigail Fisher, who's the young woman in the photo here, said that she didn't get accepted to the University of Texas because she was white. She argued, her attorneys argued, that students of color with her same exact credentials were accepted only because of their race. She was essentially challenging the affirmative action policy at the University of Texas. She ultimately lost in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no, that that policy does not violate the Equal Protections Clause at the time it was put in. But again, this is really falling in line with that modern symbolic idea that says there's no need for a policy like that because prejudice doesn't exist, even though you could say that her case being argued is an example of the idea that African Americans without the policy wouldn't get into school. That idea is one that is prejudice. It doesn't look like old-fashioned prejudice, but it's still a more subtle way of expressing feelings about African Americans. And finally, we have this main idea that modern symbolic prejudice is a form that denies that inequality still exists. And this belief translates into resentment when minority groups ask for attention or resources. So they don't like it when minorities protest. They don't like it when minorities can talk about different things that are happening in their lives. And they also believe that benefits given to these groups, are viewed as reverse prejudice. And once again, I'll say it, there's no such thing as reverse because in order for it to be reversed, that would mean that only one group can do it. Now, you all may have gotten in arguments on social media about whether white people can be racist, Black people can be racist, yada, yada, yes. The fact of the matter is the key in racism and prejudice and discrimination is not in the color of the person doing it. It's in the foundation of the action. So yes, anyone can be racist if they have a power imbalance that allows them to enact their prejudice. So a joke cannot be racist. A meme cannot be racist. A poster, I would even argue, is not racist because there is no action being put onto someone else that is fulfilling that person's prejudice. Last year, the poster from Tolo was called a racist Tolo poster. It was certainly a prejudice poster. However, that young lady and her date were not enacting their prejudice through any kind of power imbalance. Now, if they had said, no black people can be in our group because we don't like black people and we don't think they're, we don't want them to socialize with us, that gets more into the realm of racism, because we can start to see that thought of an inferior group. But again, that's a really complex idea. So really throw reverse out of your mindset and just say the word prejudice, racism, etc. So we'll continue with our third and last idea on the next video.